Okay, now that we finished both phosphorus and potassium, we're going to get a little bit more into soil fertility evaluation. And specifically, we'll talk right here mostly about soil sampling and a little bit of a revamp of plant analysis or a little bit of refresher. We've talked about this, both of these concepts, a little bit already with nitrogen. But for phosphorus and potassium, really, we focus a lot more on soil sampling and soil analysis as a way to guide our management. And so that's the justification for kind of bringing this out and fleshing it out a little bit more at this time. Okay. So I'll kind of go through this relatively quickly, but for plant analysis, of course, we can think about deficiency symptoms appear when plants can't function properly, right? And then these are often in early growth or even into later vegetative growth. Visual symptoms are really nice guides for tip us off in terms of what is happening with that plant. But again, we like to think of that as not kind of the end piece, but just really helping point us in the right direction, and then that would be confirmed with following up plant analysis. And for symptoms, just some kind of terms and definitions that you're familiar. We can think about when a plant looks abnormal, what that might be. So you'll hear the word chlorosis or chlorotic, and that's essentially a yellowing of plant material. Can be caused by a lot of things, nutrient deficiencies being one of them. If that chlorosis develops to the point where the plant or that plant part dies, that leaf or leaf stem or leaflet, whatever, then it becomes necrotic or necrosis sets in. So that's actually the death. So chlorosis and then necrosis. Okay, stunting can happen, of course, and just a general lack of vigor, lack of size of a quote-unquote normal plant part, and then a number of kind of abnormal colorations that happen. These different colorations can be localized, that is one specific part. They can be generalized across a whole leaf, and then they can be confined to the petiole. They confined to the inner vein region, so intervenal chlorosis, or chlorosis of the veins, venochlorosis, necrotic spots, etc., etc. So these are, different types of definitions that we can think about. And then, we've talked about this a number of times, but there's a lot of things that we have to be careful about when we're, quote unquote, diagnosing with certainty some sort of visual symptom. So there can be multiple deficiencies of nutrients. It can maybe not be a nutrient deficiency at all, but maybe it's damage from herbicide burn, for example, or it's insect predation, or it's some sort of disease, or maybe it's a abiotic factor like temperature, compaction, da da da. So there's a number of different things that we can think about that might manifest as what would look like a nutrient deficiency when we often aren't entirely sure. Our flow diagram here, talking about the idea of difference between mobile and immobile, and then here's essentially a very similar thing, but just kind of demonstrated a little differently in terms of a decision tree. So again, I'm blowing through this pretty quick as a recap, but and we can think about field-based versus plant-based tissue analysis. Okay, and there's advantages and disadvantages of each. Field-based typically being a little bit cheaper, less precise information immediately. Lab-based typically more precise, a little bit more expensive, and then you have got to wait. You can't be in the field and make a decision right then, right? Tissue sampling for agronomic crops, field crops, often happens late vegetative or early reproductive, as we've discussed. Then those plant parts are sampled, sent into a lab, and typically via ICP, this inductively coupled plasma spectrometry, is how your values, a value of how much P, how much K, how much nutrient would be in there. Okay. All right, so that's a really kind of whirlwind recap of plant tissue and testing. And this, there's we don't get into a lot of it here, but there is room for this, of course, for managing P and K. And people look at and do plant tissue for P and K testing as well. Our focus here is really going to be on soil sampling, soil testing, because of that being the primary way that P and K are managed and the primary diagnostic tool for managing P and K fertility in soil. Okay, so on to soil sampling. The foundation of soil fertility is soil testing. Without soil testing, it's very, very difficult to manage nutrients. It's very difficult to really have a good handle on what your soil needs or how it should be managed. I can't really overstate this enough. Just understanding that soil testing is vitally important for management of nutrients and just kind of the whole study of a soil's fertility. So we can think of soil tests with different objectives, okay, and these would broadly be maybe the three ways that we would use soil test information. So first, it can provide an index of nutrient availability. So soil tests and soil test extractants specifically are designed to extract not the total pool of phosphorus or potassium, but what is plant available, okay? So just providing that index of availability or some sort of relative measurement of nutrient availability in the soil. We can also think of soil testing as providing an index of nutrient loss and transport. So moving off, we just talked a lot about phosphorus, and high phosphorus testing fields we know are more susceptible to phosphorus loss. And that's why when you're in the P risk index and you increase your soil test P levels, guess what's going to happen typically with the amount of phosphorus loss? Well, as soil test level increases, phosphorus loss is going to increase as well. So an estimate of loss is possible. It's not, obviously it's not a perfect estimate, but it provides, again, relative framework in terms of small losses versus relatively larger losses. And then finally, kind of narrowing a little bit finer or more focus is the idea of being able to predict the probability of seeing a yield response and maybe being that profitable for either fertilizer or lime. Okay, so again, we can look at a soil test. Of course, this third one is highly related to that first point, but we can look at a soil test number and say, okay, well, these two, soil A is lower or less available for K than soil B, for example. But then if we've got the appropriate information, i.e. fertilizer recommendations, we can say, okay, because soil A has a value of 80 part per million soil test phosphorus, then we need to apply X amount of potassium fertilizer to maximize productivity or to optimize our inputs. So there's a number of different reasons that we can, or why we might want a soil test in the first place. And anytime we soil test, we need to consider at least 4 factors. These would be kind of the primary ones that I would point people to: depth, time of year that we sample, the frequency or the intervals between samplings, and then the actual area to sample. So let's dive into each one of these, okay? Taking a soil sample, depth is really, really important. If we don't have consistent depth, then we have a very difficult time understanding actually what those values mean. So this idea is soil stratification, which we've talked a little bit about before. Stratification being nutrients are in the surface of the soil are distributed. They occur in greater concentrations than as you go through depth, and this is a very common thing that happens in managed systems, ag systems, it happens in natural systems, et cetera, et cetera. When we don't have that tillage event, that disturbing and like full mixing, stratification is accentuated or is exaggerated in some sense. When we mix, we can actually we can kind of ameliorate the differences a little bit more. Okay, so let's just imagine this is soil in inches. So imagine if we took a soil sample at 10 inches versus 20 inches, and we tried to compare those values. Well, if depending on say if we this non-manured soil might not be too big of a deal, but the soils that did receive manure over here, a 10-inch soil sample versus a 20-inch soil sample is going to return very different numbers, okay? Because a lot of these higher values, of course, will be diluted by the lower testing values less than 10 here. So for Ohio, most of our recommendations are based on a 0 to 8 inch depth. That's 20 centimeters. 0 to 8 inches is kind of a non-official plow layer when there was a lot of plowing that occurred, and so it's just it's somewhat arbitrary, but it's just a good kind of standard measurement. Now, if you go out in the real world and you see crop consultants, co-ops often don't sample to 8 depth. Maybe they'll sample to 6 inches. Maybe they'll sample to 5 or 4. So it really depends on the operation and the operator, but most of the university recommendations are calibrated to a 0 to 8 inch depth. Okay, other things to consider: time of year. Sampling in early spring or the fall. This is a period when crops aren't actively growing. Again, so much of soil testing, and this is what we really try to kind of drive home this point, is that there's not a particularly perfect ways to do it, but whatever you do, just make sure you stick with that system and do things when you consistently from time to time. So if you're going to sample a field and you're going to do it in the fall and you're going to sample at a 0 to 8 inch depth, if you come back 3 years later and then you sample in the spring, or even worse, in say the middle of the summer, and you sample to 6 inches, how consistent is that information going to be from time to time, right? And so the idea is that we want to be very consistent about how we do this, so we can look at how our management is impacting and the soil test values and make modifications to that. So I'm getting a little off track here, but that's kind of in the context of this idea of adaptive nutrient management. So the time of year, it's spring or fall, either one is fine, but just whatever your regime for that particular field, stick with it and continue. The frequency, we typically recommend soil sampling every 3 or 4 years. In soils that have really high rates of nutrient removal, if they're very low CEC soils, that is sandy soils, we might think about once every other year, or every even once a year, depending on your operation. But it's pretty common for people to sample somewhere between 3 and 4 years, sometimes even 5 years. But again, that just depends on where your soil test level's at and what you're trying to do. And the final point is this idea of area. So how are we going to take a field and divide it up based on any number of criteria? So whole field sampling, grid sampling, and zone sampling. And just basically imagine we have a field here that has some features. There's an old farmyard where say livestock were penned and then were fed in a confined area, so that they might have hay was brought in, for example, and then there's a lot of manure that's been deposited and really enriched this site. Maybe there's an upper slope, most of the field's flat, then there's this like saline kind of salt band that goes through here. So in this scenario, we can think about 3 different approaches: a whole field sampling, which would literally be the whole field. You just go out and you sample the whole field. So here there's 28, each one of these circles represents a soil probe, 28 different soil probes. If you can count all these up, that last number right there is 28. Those are all composited, i.e. put into, say, a bucket or a common bin and then mixed up. Then we take a small sample of that and we send that to the lab. Another approach would be grid sampling, where we just systematically lay a grid across this field, and then we sample at given designated grid points. Okay. And then the final approach would be zone sampling, where we have some previous history of a field. We're going to go out and we're going to split it up into however many zones might be appropriate. Zone 1 for the upslope, Zone 2 for this saline band, Zone 3 for kind of the rest of the field. You could even think about putting a Zone 4 in here for this where this old farmyard pen used to be. So each one of these has pluses and minuses, advantages and disadvantages that we'll get into right now. So whole field sampling is typically the easiest and the cheapest. It's going to give you one value for the entire field. So if you're only applying one rate of fertilizer, that is, you're not doing any kind of variable rate, and you're just interested in some measurement, then this potentially could be an appropriate approach. So it's cheaper. It gives you absolutely no information about variability rate. So if you went out here and you sampled, this core is really going to elevate soil test levels. This core is going to elevate salt, extractable salts in your extract. So if that's not important to you, or if you don't kind of care about that variability, then so be it, right? We want to avoid unusual areas when we're doing field sampling, like depressions or places that are very wet or very dry or whatever. And this is kind of considered a bit old school soil sampling, but it still happens. Old recommendations. Our tri-states, I think the current recommendations say no more than one soil sample every 25 acres. That would be, I just think that's, it's just too large of an area. So there's nothing magical about this 10 acres. It's just a rule of thumb. So if your field's greater than 10 acres, you really should be pulling multiple soil samples, okay? And again, the idea, let's talk about composited versus soil core. So a soil sample versus a soil core. Here's an example of a field where we'd go out and we'd put a sample. Each one of these circles represents an actual soil core that we would take to 8-inch depth, pull that soil core out, throw it in a bucket or in a bag, and then continue down the line, okay? And then you could either submit that entire soil sample, or if you take a lot of cores, we might think about just mixing it thoroughly, taking half of it, discarding it, and then keeping half that you're actually going to submit to that lab. Zone sampling, again, we're dividing fields into smaller subunits based on some kind of known thing. So a management history, the topography, soil type. People commonly do this. They split fields up. They use Surgo data, soil science database data, and then they get ideas of soil type and drainage classes, etc. Even previous yield maps, so getting an idea of how this field is yielding and where the quote-unquote high-yielding areas are versus the low-yielding areas, and then making your zones based on that. So zone sampling requires some sort of known history of the field. Okay, zone sampling is best where management may differ across the field. So I would argue that it's good to know how soils are, how they vary, and what some of that spatial variability is. But it's really going to benefit you if you have, you might apply fertilizer rates or lime at different rates depending on what zone you're in. Okay, typically the borders are georeferenced, and it of course gives you a better assessment than whole field, but it is more expensive and more time consuming because you gotta do this work of splitting the field out, delineating it, etc., etc. And then finally, there's grid sampling. And then this of course is even more important when nutrients applied may vary. Grid sampling is a good practice, especially coming into a field that you know very little about. So maybe you're renting. A farmer's going to go rent a new field down the street or something. They don't know too much about it. They've never farmed it before. Gives you a good assessment, but it's typically more expensive because samples, you're often going to have more samples per acre than you would with the other two approaches. So grid sampling can be done a few different ways. You can actually, again, you're going to kind of arbitrarily lay a grid across, and there's software and whatnot that helps you do all this, right? But you're going to lay a grid across the field, and then you could either sample different points within that grid cell, but much more commonly what you do is that you go to where the two grid points intersect, and then you soil sample. And so this is done very, very frequently, and let's talk a little bit more about this just in terms of kind of some of the advantages and disadvantages, right? So one of the questions we always get is how many samples do you need per acre to have a good soil test? And there's been studies done on this. There's no perfect answer. There's always a trade-off between getting very precise information about the variability in the field and how much you're going to spend on actually pulling those soil samples, how much time and money you're going to spend doing that, submitting that to a lab and getting information. Here's kind of an extreme example from Nebraska showing that we've got samples here. This is for nitrate, again, a highly variable measurement, but 4.2 samples per acre. That's basically a quarter acre field sampling, which would be very, very high density. In other words, one sample that is, 8, 10 cores per composited cores make up a sample. And then something like this would be over a quarter acre field, right? And then there's that's where I'm saying this 4.2 samples per acre. Then they took and they increased that by a factor of 10. So instead of a quarter of an acre, instead of 0.25 acres, it's 0.025 acres now. And when you do that, you can see there's a lot more enrichment of information, okay? And so you're like, oh my goodness, well that's really important. These two things, the same field, give very different information. So it's true, they do. But the question is like, does this information, can you actually use it? Is it helpful? Can you manage it? Will it help you change your management, improve your management? That's kind of one of those questions that growers have to ask themselves. So what's very typical, something like 5 or 2.5 acre grid. So in other words, one sample every 2.5 acres. This is probably the most common grid density that's sampled in Ohio. A lot of people have moved towards higher densities than that. So maybe one sample every acre, or maybe even one sample every half acre, something like that. So it really depends on the operation and whatnot, but this can give you a lot of very good information. But of course, you can see how this can add up quite quickly if you're doing one sample every 2.5 acres, or even higher density than that. And so, how often do you need to do this? For soil organic matter and CEC, maybe every 10 or 20 years. For pH, maybe every 5 or 10 years. But for the nutrients, we are often doing this for nutrients and pH first and foremost. We might think about grid sampling every 3 or 4 years. So some people will go out and they'll do a very intensive grid sampling, and then they'll come back maybe and do in year 3 or 4, and then do like a less intensive, and then they'll come, so then they might come back again and then do like a more intensive. So they just, there's a lot of different philosophies on how to do this, and there's no particularly one right way to do it. Part of it is just how much you're willing to invest, what are you going to do with that information, and, is it worth it to you for that investment, okay? And I guess I will say, what's much more common, this kind of cell sampling is much less common. This is typically what's done, where people will go out and they'll just sample sometimes 3, 4, 5 cores on a grid acre, and we don't recommend that. There's been plenty of studies that have shown that you typically need in a field scale, you need somewhere between like 10 and 12, maybe even higher, 15 cores to make a pretty representative soil sample. So if you're only doing 4 or 5, that's, you've got a much greater chance of hitting a hot spot or a really low spot and skewing your values. So unfortunately, what's practiced quite often is, when crop consultants are going out and sampling someone's field, this is a very common service that's done. People often don't want to kind of deal with soil sampling, so they might farm it out to a private company or somebody that they're working with, and they might go in and just try to pull as many soils quickly in a field as they can. And so sometimes those shortcuts are ill-advised, right? So just something to keep in mind in terms of what we recommend as a university versus what's practiced many times, okay? And here's a classic example of why just having a few soil cores to make up a sample can be a bad idea. Because if people are banding fertilizer, that's what this is showing, distance between banded and broadcast fertilizer. And if you're pulling a sample, say right in a row where there was crop grown and fertilizer banded, you can get very different values from your soil test. So if you just go down a line and you're inadvertently pulling directly from where fertility was applied, banded on a row, and you pull 4 samples and they're all in this row, and it's telling you, oh, you've got plenty of fertility, but really the majority of the field, the average might be somewhere half of what that soil test value is going to be. So just a word of caution in terms of understanding when you're soil sampling, having some idea of field history really helps make those decisions in terms of where to pull those cores. Okay, so for those poor souls that haven't ever soil sampled in their life, it's a very fun time. I highly recommend you do that. Unfortunately, as an online offering, we can't we can't go out in the field and do this. But there's lots of different implements to do this. There's kind of augers, these Dutch type augers. Typically, something like this as a soil core would be the common tool of the trade, where you're just going to push this straight down to a given depth, maybe 8 inches. It's got a cutaway window here, so this is essentially what you're looking at right here is the inside of the core. This is the exterior of the core, but you push this down to a set depth, you pull it out, and the core pops out, and you get this. They've got automated soil samplers. This is a Wintex machine coming out of Iowa, and this guy is going to be, there's a probe here. He presses a button, the probe goes down, pulls a soil sample, dumps it, and then he moves to another place in the field. So this just really helps automate the process. And there's a lot of things that are out there. A lot of people, have been working on trying to make this process faster. How do we actually go out and pull soil samples and do that rapidly? So there's some YouTube videos that you can check out yourself if you're interested. This is the Wintex 1000 machine that we just looked at. There's different types of probes out there, maybe not even these soil cores, but maybe a soil slice. And then there's also implements just for taking deep core samples. So this typically wouldn't be what we do in, say, for fertility management, but it might be important for other things if we're looking at soil, subsoil interactions, or even trying to get an assessment of acidity or nutrient levels kind of below what we would consider, maybe not fully below the rooting zone, but something a lot greater than 1.5 feet, 2 feet deep. We can use these hydraulic direct push cores that actually, have quite a bit of power and can extract soil. So, okay, I think that's all I have. So I'll end there. We're going to pick up with the next talk about soil testing and kind of how we go about developing fertilizer recommendations. Okay.